And so now it is my pleasure to introduce some bios for our plenary speakers. For many of you who were up early this morning, you had a chance to hear some of the research talks that were given by our three plenary speakers and their partners. They each got to pick someone to join them in the symposium. But now they're going to be coming to talk to us, and we're going to have a conversation here that we're calling Perspectives on Diversity. So our first panelist is Dr. Maydianne Andrade. Maydianne Andrade has a BSc from Simon Fraser University and an MSc from the University of Toronto, Mississauga, a Ph.D. in neurobiology and behavior from Cornell University. She is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Professor Andrade's fundamental research uses black widow spiders as models for understanding links between ecology, evolution, and behavior, particularly as these processes are related to mating, species diversity, plasticity, and other responses to environmental variation. Professor Andrade has many accolades, including that she was an NSERC University Faculty Award recipient, a Canada Research Chair in Integrative Behavioral Ecology. She is a fellow in the Animal Behavior Society and the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. Professor Andrade is an elected honorary international member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Andrade received the Animal Behavior Society Exemplar Award and the Lawrence Burpee Medal by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. She has served as a special advisor to the Dean on Inclusive Recruitment and Equity Education, and as Vice Dean Faculty of Affairs, Equity, and Success, and Acting Vice Principal Academic and Dean. Professor Andrade co-founded the Canadian Black Scientists Network and is currently serving as the inaugural president of this network. She founded and co-chairs the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence, or TIDE. Dr. Andrade was awarded the Ludwig and Estelle Just Memorial Human Rights Prize. Professor Andrade has also served as guest host for The Nature of Things with David Suzuki and a panelist on the CBC radio show Imaging the World, Darwin and the Idea of Evolution. Professor Andrade also co-created and hosts the podcast The New Normal. So welcome, Professor Andrade. Our next speaker is Dr. Cassandra Extavour. Dr. Cassandra Extavour's laboratory is interested in understanding early embryonic development, the genes that control this development, the evolutionary origins of these genes, and how their functions have changed over evolutionary time. The lab is particularly interested in the development and evolution of reproductive systems, including both germ cells and somatic gonad cells. Dr. Extavour earned an honors BSc at the University of Toronto and a PhD at the Autonomous University of Madrid. She has received numerous honors and awards, including the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, Trinity College and Edward Blake Admission Scholarship, and the Robert Phillips Award for Excellence in Spanish as an undergraduate student, and the Ellison Medical Foundation New Scholar in Aging Award as an assistant professor. For her teaching and mentoring activities, she has been nominated for the Joseph R. Levinson Memorial Teaching Prize and the Harvard Graduate Women in Science and Engineering Mentoring Award. Outside of the lab, Dr. Extavour has been a musician and a performer since the age of 5 and a professional classical singer since her undergraduate days in Toronto. I've heard Cassandra sing. Her voice is truly beautiful. We also are joined by Dr. Swanne Gordon. Dr. Swanne Gordon received her BSc in zoology from Michigan State University, her MSc in biology from McGill University, and a PhD in biology from the University of California, Riverside. Along each of these stages, she has secured independent funding and numerous awards, including a prestigious postdoctoral Academy of Finland research fellowship at Jyväskylä. I learned how to pronounce that proper Finnish name. Thank you, Swanne. Dr. Gordon is currently an assistant professor at Cornell University, where her research is built around the underlying question, why is there diversity in nature and how is it maintained? She performs it typically in 2 systems, the rapidly evolving Trinidadian guppy and the globally widespread aposematic wood tiger moth. So we're going to be having a conversation here on stage, and Dr. Chris McQuarrie, who joins us here in the audience and is a co-organizer of this session, is going to be moderating the Q&A. So if you have a question for the panel, you can enter it via the mobile app, and Dr. McQuarrie will facilitate posing those to Drs. Gordon, Extavour, and Andrade. So welcome, Dr. Extavour is going to be joining us virtually, and Dr. Andrade and Dr. Gordon are here on stage. Welcome. So we could be doing almost anything right now. It's Sunday night, right, in November, but we're not. We're here at an Entomological Society joint annual meeting and conference. And so my first question, I guess, is, why do you do what you do? Why are we here as entomologists? What's your passion and kind of what gets you going with your work? Maybe we'll start with Swanne.
Why do I do what I do? I ask myself that question all the time. I think the answer changes, throughout different stages of my career. But I think the answer, I could probably put it in 3 different ways. I do what I do because I love it, and so nothing brings me greater joy than, oh, hi, Cassandra. Nothing brings me greater joy than being out in the field and, mentoring students and teaching. I also do what I do because I fell into it. I was born in Canada. My dad is a scientist. He did his graduate degree at McGill University, but of course in the 70s it was really hard for a Black scientist, and so they ended up forcing him out of the program. He got a master's. He still ended up, eventually being successful. But for him, me going into academia was something that he didn't support. He didn't think that academia was ready for Black scientists. And so I think for the longest time, the career that I wanted to go into was medicine or to be a vet. And at some point, I was able to intern in a research lab just to get some, experience for medical school. And then I fell in love with it. I absolutely fell in love with it and ended up kind of saying, okay, I'll do a master's for 2 years, and then I'll go to medical school. And then I kept saying, and then I'll go to medical school until it just became, my career. And then the third thing is that I feel like my experiences made me raised for it. And my dad, after he graduated from McGill, he ended up accepting a job being a consultant to the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And so we moved to Jamaica for a couple of years. And as a child, that was a defining moment. I'd always loved nature, but now being able to see this switch from what I recognized in Montreal, Canada, as a small child growing up, and then switching to the flora and fauna of Jamaica and the interaction that people have with the environment, I think were defining moments that kind of led me to be here. So I guess, my answer is 3 parts. I love it, I'm kind of raised to do it, and then also, like many people, I fell into it.
Thanks, Swanne. Cassandra.
Yeah, thanks. It's nice to see all of you. I hope you can see and hear me all right. Let me see. I think the single most compelling thing for me about this career is the opportunity to solve problems. I love solving problems. The more complicated, the better. The more different moving parts, the better. I love trying to take something really complicated and strip it down to something that contains as few moving parts as possible, and then gradually add them back one at a time. And the natural world and its evolution is sort of infinitely complex. And so really it's about the fun of trying to solve puzzles and trying to find an answer to something that I think is really hard to understand. The second big driver for me is something that I didn't realize was an element of this career until I got to know that it was a career. I didn't realize that I could have a career doing what I do for a really long time. But the element of it that I love the most, besides the content of it, is the degree of independence that I have. I have an enormous amount of independence and flexibility in the work that I do. much more than many other professions can offer. I can work when I want, I can work how I want, I can work within my own lab with the people that I want to work with. I can work on whatever I want. I can choose how I work on it. There's some minimum price that I have to pay. I have to convince some pretty small number of people around the world that I should get money to do it, right? And so I have to convince my colleagues and peers and funding bodies and people to join the group and work with us. But from my point of view, that's a pretty small price to pay, and it's a pretty small amount of work to go into compared to the freedom and independence that it offers, because having freedom and independence have always been really important to me. So those are the two main drivers for me, just the curiosity about the world and the degree of independence that I get to have to choose how to follow that curiosity.
Thanks, Dr. Extavour. Maydianne.
Thanks very much, Jessica. So I came about this a different way. I think I love controlling things. I love understanding things. And I think those two things made me predisposed to work with invertebrates. But my parents didn't go to university. My mom wasn't able to finish high school. And so I knew nothing about this world. I did know that I loved science from day one. And when I got to university, I wanted to be a doctor too, because if you like biology, that's what people tell you to do. And it was all of 1 month into intro bio when I realized I wanted to do research, because I had an outstanding professor who talked about research. And I just thought, wow, I could do what he's doing. And it had never occurred to me that it was a job either. But once I got into that and I started to look into what sort of research I might want to do, I actually wasn't in love with insects and spiders at that point. I was afraid of them. I didn't have a lot of experience in nature as a child. I grew up in suburban Vancouver, actually, in Burnaby, and my parents didn't come from a culture where you would go out and go camping. They used to say, why would you deliberately go somewhere where there's no running water? Like, why would you do that? So I came to insects and spiders secondarily, and it really is because I like to control things. I love to experiment and to also see how things play out in the field. And that's really hard to do with vertebrates in a way that's realistic. So once I became clear to me that the type of experimental work that you could do in this field was just creative and innovative, and that you, as Cassandra said, could basically choose your way. It just became really clear to me that invertebrates were the ultimate study organisms, and among those, black widows are better than insects.
Well, dragonflies are pretty good predators too. I'll just lay that on the table. So we've all, in some ways, made it. I mean, here we are on this stage being able to share our viewpoints with everybody here. And so I guess I'm just curious, who makes it? What do you think it is that allows us to be here? What has allowed us to kind of make it in entomology or arachnology and what have you? Many of us, one of the red threads that kind of ties us all together is we do have a U.S.-Canadian connection. We're all black women on the stage. I don't think we've ever had this in an entomology meeting to have all of us here on the stage. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are. I'll start with you, Maydianne.
Okay. An easy question. Sometimes once you've made it, and students come to you asking for something, in my case, can we have a lab statement of values that describes our goals as scientists and as people? And you think, I never needed that. Why do we need this thing? And because once you've made it, you've been through the filter, and there are a lot of other people who didn't make it through that filter who we never meet. And I think the thing that allowed me to get through the filter was essentially the ability to separate the things that were consistently telling me I didn't belong here. And in fact, I now do equity education, and one of the things I do is share some of the things that people have said to me through the course of my career. My husband had to remind me of some of them, because you actually have to separate it in your mind in order to be able to move forward. So people who aren't able to do that, even if they're outstanding, creative, high potential researchers, don't make it through our current system. So we are losing talent. We're leaving talent on the table, as they say in the corporate world. And I just don't think we can afford to do that in the current context.
Thank you. Swanne?
I think that was so wonderfully said. I love that you're asking the question, how did we make it? I'm sitting here amongst giants, as a new assistant professor. So I don't know if I made it yet, but I have made it, far further than I would have thought starting out. I think Maydianne hit on a really important part about representation, about feelings of belonging and inclusion. And that is something that I really had to struggle with throughout my career, not only with the microaggressions, but just feeling like I didn't have as many examples as someone that maybe looked like me or acted like me, that I felt that I could be here sitting in this position today. And so I think there are a lot of metrics that people talk about when they think in terms of success, the awards, the type of mentorship that you might have, right? The type of network that you might have, the type of training, the institutions that you come from, the funding that you may have been able to build, right? And so we think about those metrics, and then we think that there are certain successful phenotypes, people that kind of can gather these sorts of metrics. And I think I love that what you brought up was thinking about that myth of exceptionalism, right? That if you achieve all of these things, then success is right around the corner. And I think we've all learned that there are a lot of obstacles and structural kind of biases, that it doesn't matter how many of the good things that you do, right? You're just not going to get through the door. And I remember meeting a variety of Black and brown scientists when I was a student, right? And we all wanted the same goal. We wanted to get to that, elusive professorship in academia. And when I turned around at some point, none of them were there, right? And so there are these filters that are barring many people, many voices from getting to that next level. And I think what you're touching on is the fact that with the type of crises that we're noticing in this world, right? The insect decline, climate crises, et cetera, they're all connected. And the key thing that I always say is that to solve any of these problems, it's going to take international connections. It's going to take highlighting different voices, diverse voices, perspectives, and local voices. And in order to do that, right, then we need to break down some of these filters, and we need to break down the myth of what are the common things that kind of link us and make us get here, right? Because a lot of it just boils down to luck, a lot of it boils down to bias, and then I think in acknowledging that, we can at least open the door to other people because we maybe won't feel so special.
And Cassandra, we talked a little bit before we had a kind of a pre-planning call. I'm asking you the same question, and you and I both moved to the States, and we were kind of seen as maybe exceptional because we were Canadians in the States. I'd love to know your thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I definitely agree with everything that Maydianne and Swanne have said so far. There's so many more people interested in doing academic research at many different levels than there are positions for it, especially at the sort of traditional academic group leader position. That it's not going to work out anytime soon. Things might be shifting now that the number of people that everyone can always get exactly the sort of position that they think they would like to have, and so you definitely have to do a lot of work, and yet that's not a sufficient quality. I mean, I think the single most thing that I always think about is that there is no single parameter that is definitely a silver bullet decider in terms of success or making it, or just even retention. There are many different essential qualities, but no single one of them is important. It's essential to perform high quality original work, but that's not sufficient. It's essential to have at least one mentor somewhere, someone who recognizes you and helps you and extends a hand so you can get from one point to another point. But that's not enough either. It's essential to be lucky to apply for positions, whether it's Ph.D. positions or faculty positions, at a time and at a place that happens to fit what you have and want what you happen to have in that moment. That's essential, but it's not sufficient. And one of the things that can make it possible for people to choose to stay or to stand, to be able to bear it, to stay, when you are such an underrepresented and actively excluded person, let's say, we all happen to be Black women on this stage right now, as Maydianne said, you also have to have a willingness or an ability, at least some fraction of the time, to ignore the constant messages that you don't belong here and the relative lack of those other mentorship and assistance methods. And as you're alluding to, Jessica, one of the other things that can help you if you're in a position where you're not a sort of a status quo phenotype, typically well-connected and well-mentored person in the system, is if you pose less of a threat, despite being different, right? And so many of us who are Black women in this system are relatively light-skinned. And so we are not as different appearing or as different or as threatening to the majority of people because we don't stand out as much as we otherwise might. The negative stereotypes that come along with being a very dark-skinned person apply less to us. And so we pose less of a threat. We have the ability to sound relatively unthreatening without extremely noticeable accents. We either sound like that or we've learned how to sound like that. We know how to sound like that. When you're working in one culture, for example, the United States, which is just a disaster in terms of trying to deal with race in any sensible way, the more you can not really be of the United States, the easier it can be to be accepted as a Black person because you're not as threatening as the African American population that is here. You're not so-called, as I've been told and as my cousins have been told, you're not like them. You're not one of them. You're not really that Black. So you're Canadian or you're Caribbean or you're from Africa or you're not really from here. And so somehow it's sort of different. And that is also less threatening to many of the colleagues that you're going to be working with. And so all of these things mean that it's interesting. Many organizations are taking a look at their demographics and wondering why they're so homogeneous for the first time. They seem to be wondering this, and they may feel proud or maybe noticing the few non-white faculty that they have or students or postdocs. And yet, if within the United States, at least, for example, if you look at people reporting increasing numbers of Black and brown faculty or students or whatever, what is also important to ask is how many of those are really American citizens and how many of them are, like me, sort of flown in from outside. That's not the purpose to which, we applied for this. We weren't brought here for that purpose. But, African Americans have a much harder time gaining traction in the United States, for example, than Black people from other places very often because we are less of a threat.
Do you find something similar in Canada, Maydianne?
Yeah, I was going to say I would like to follow up on that. One of the things we've really found with the Canadian Black Scientists Network, I was born in Jamaica. A lot of people there have been born in the Caribbean or in Africa. And the data that we have available from Toronto, which is the largest population of Black people in Canada, shows that for Black people, unlike every other immigrant group or newcomer group, the success and the education of multiple generations goes down over time. Other immigrant groups, it goes up. And what we also know is that Black students are streamed out of academic courses in high school, which means they can't go to university easily because they don't get those prerequisites. And there are studies that show that even students, Black students who have really good grades, are encouraged to take applied courses in high school because they'll keep up their grades. And parents have to advocate for them. In fact, one of the members of our steering committee is a physicist, and he said it was his mother who consistently went into the school and said, "You are not putting my child in applied courses. My child's going to university." So that's the kind of thing that people come in with. It happens in Canada as well, although a lot of Canadians kind of don't realize it. And so this is a consistent problem and message and theme.
Thank you. But one of the things that you've all kind of touched on is perhaps some of the mentorship that allowed you to perhaps pass through the filter, whether it's, parents, family members, non-traditional mentors, and the mentors for your academic careers. I thought maybe it might be interesting to hear a little bit about who your mentors were and what you think makes a good mentor. Maybe we'll start with Swanne.
Okay, well.
No pressure.
I've had some really good mentors in my life, and I must admit that a lot of the mentors that have been very inspirational for enabling me to be here have also mainly been outside of academia or been non-official mentors. And I think that's always been key for me. And so now when I mentor other students, other graduate students, I try to tell them to make sure that you spread your network wide. Make sure that you have mentors that can support you for all the different facets of who you are and where you want to be in the future. I think that's extremely important. There are some mentors that can do massive harm, especially if you're an underrepresented collective, right? And that's something I think as a field of entomology, but also ecology and evolution, that we need to be aware of, that our mentorship is kind of broken because we do not get the right training for helping, right, diversify any of these types of fields. And I think that's important to mention. Of course, as a young scientist, I learned that one of the important metrics to success, just as we were talking about, is the type of mentor that you have. And they didn't mean the type of mentor, what they meant was how big that mentor was. And so I tried to stray from that. In my master's, I went with a professor that was new, an assistant professor, but then he ended up becoming, pretty big. And then for my PhD, I went what everyone did, right? I went with the big names. I went with the big name for my postdoc. And yes, I'm sitting here. So maybe there's some aspects of being with certain mentors, being in certain groups that give you those connections that can lead to it. But I do think that we need to talk a lot about how we can mentor people that may not be like you in a variety of different metrics.
Thanks, Swanne. How about you, Maydianne?
So I actually, my mentors were all traditional, and I want to call out here Simon Fraser University, Larry Dill, Bernie Reutberg were two huge figures in my early life. Bernie Reutberg took me to my first conference, which was NSOC of BC. Thank you, NSOC of BC. Larry Dill, when I applied to grad school, wrote me a letter. He was also that professor in first year who got me turned on to science. And he showed me the letter, and that was huge. At the time, no one knew about imposter syndrome. He would have noticed probably that I was the only Black person in my class at SFU, I think actually in all 4 years in biology when I was at SFU, and he recognized that I needed to know that he thought I was good, and that was huge. Daryl Gwynn, who was my master's advisor, quietly made sure that I felt safe when I was doing my field work. As a woman, as a Black woman working on a nocturnal species in Australia, that was extremely important. I didn't appreciate till later just how important, that he never made me feel like it was a big deal. He just made sure it was there. People need to have education about how to be a mentor, especially if you're mentoring someone from an underrepresented group. It can feel fraught, like you can make mistakes, and I know that terrifies people. I should say all of those people were white men of a certain age, and they were fantastic. Nowadays we know, I think, most of us know we're Black. So you can say, I recognize that you may have a different experience than me. I would like to mentor you in a way that's supportive. Tell me how you think I can help. I think you're more likely to make mistakes if you make assumptions about the person. What you heard here was one of us had a father who was a scientist. One of us has parents who didn't go to university, right? We're all different. And so that's what I would recommend. And I would just say, we really can't do this without members of the statistically dominant group stepping up and making sure that we become a truly inclusive type of scholarly field and profession.
Thanks, Maydianne. Cassandra?
Yes, I think, for me, when I think about mentorship, it's really come from, as Swanne was saying a little bit, so many different places. I really think that everyone who you encounter in your life has something that they can teach you and something that you can learn from in a positive way and sometimes in a negative way, in the sense that you may see a pattern or a behavior or an outcome and you think, wow, I wonder how I could avoid that in the future, or I wonder how I could do something differently. And that's starting from your parents or your guardians when you were a child to the children that you play with and so on. So my parents, I definitely credit with being my number one, so they just have believed in me from the beginning. Whatever it was that I said I wanted to do, even if they didn't know what it was, they also didn't go to university. But if I said that I wanted to do something, they said, well, that sounds interesting. And what's your plan for achieving that? They never doubted that I could generate a plan, but they let me know that whatever I wanted to achieve, I needed to have a plan, and then I needed to act on it. And if I didn't want to do it anymore, then I needed to relinquish that responsibility, whether if I took on a responsibility, I should fulfill it. And so I really learned that from them. My PhD and postdoc mentors were, again, very traditional senior white men, extremely supportive in their own way. From my PhD advisor, I learned the importance of being true to your own instincts and your own intellectual rigor, even when other people, even your peers and even senior people to you, might think that you're wrong. If you really think you're doing the best work possible, then you need to stick to that. And Antonio Garcia Bellido, my PhD advisor, was an amazing example of that. From his earliest days in his career, many people thought that the ideas that he was talking about didn't make any sense at all. And he either didn't care or pretended he didn't care and just kept going with him. And he turned out to be right, but it took several decades for people to recognize that. And so that was a really important example for me, and not only intellectually, but also personally. And a little bit like Maydianne was saying right at the beginning, we are going to have people who tell us directly or indirectly that we're wrong, that we shouldn't be here, that we don't deserve to be here, or that there's no way that we could have anything to contribute. And if we really believe that that's wrong, then Antonio was an example in a certain way of the importance of sticking with what you really believe and trusting yourself. And Michael Aka, my postdoctoral mentor, he gave me a lot of opportunities for professional growth and development by giving me extreme independence in what I worked on and how I did it. And I supervised my own research team. And he gave me the opportunity to learn what it was like to have much more responsibility than just for one's own experiments, which is typically the postdoc experience. You just focus on your own work. But he gave me the chance to see what it was like to be responsible for much more than that. And that was very useful in me being able to imagine realistically that I might be able to enjoy running my own group. But I think, the key thing that I think of in terms of mentorship is that we can learn so many different things from different people, and someone who is a really poor mentoring fit for one person might be an outstanding mentoring fit for a second person. I mean, I think universal qualities probably of good mentors will be universal qualities of compassionate, empathetic, mature people in general. But mentorship relationship and an advising relationship is extremely personal. And so what's really more important, for example, it's useful to talk with friends or colleagues about mentors that have been useful for them. But more important than advice that I think you might get from others is to have an interaction with someone who you think you might want to mentor or be the mentee of, have that interaction yourself and see whether or not you think it's going to work for you, because it may not have worked for someone but it may work very well for you depending on what your expectations are and what you can get out of it.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Cassandra. I feel like since you mentioned SFU, I need to give a big props to UBC because that's where I got my first mentorship. So big props to UBC. For the Americans in the room, SFU and UBC are both in Vancouver with a lot of love for each other. So good university time. I'm going to turn to Chris now to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Sure. Thank you. I feel like I should put a plug in for the University of Saskatchewan. But, so RJ has asked, have you ever felt resentful towards or tired of what feels like extra pressure to be a champion for EDI, DEI, and work in your field or because of who you are? And if you have, how do you work through that?
Who'd like to field that one?
I can start. So I basically ignored all the asks for EDI anything until I was promoted, not tenured, but actually a full-rank professor. And so people who do it earlier, I respect you. When I first started, when I first offered my job, one of my committee members, who was Indigenous, took me aside and said, they will try to put you on every single committee. If you go on every single committee, you will not get tenure. Don't do it. And it really echoed in my brain. Now, having said that, I said yes to some proportion of things I was asked for, to do, not recognizing that I was being asked about 300 times more than your typical person who wasn't like me. And so after I got what in academia, in our context, was a 3-year review where they first check how you're doing on the way to tenure, again, another mentor, another white male colleague, came to me and said, get off 3/4 of those committees. And so basically, I didn't do it until I was promoted, and I will admit that part of the reason for that is I didn't feel I had any expertise. The other part was I thought things were going to change. And I will just have to tell you that that all changed when I started looking around and recognizing I was hearing my junior colleagues saying the same things I'd heard from my senior colleagues, which I thought were going to disappear with retirements. It has nothing to do with age. It doesn't even have anything to do really with your racial background. I've also heard people who are from racialized groups saying something similar. And that is, I'd say the biggest mistake is confounding patterns with causation, which is not something we would do in our science, but people do all the time when they see statistics about people of color. So I'll stop with that.
Thanks. Is there another question, Chris?
I can go to the next. Sure. So Jennifer has asked, so you're speaking to members of 3 societies here, and what should our societies do to make sure this is a good place for our current and future members to thrive?
That's a good question. Swanne?
Yeah, I can kind of take that one. But first, I want to touch on that last question as well, because I think that was fantastically answered. But as an early career researcher, I enjoy having conversations with more senior scientists like Cassandra, Maydianne, for exactly what you just said, and also you, Jessica, because a lot of our experiences are the same. And so sometimes when I talk to people that might not be members of underrepresented groups, and I tell them, oh, somebody didn't think I belonged to the conference because I didn't wear my badge, or someone handed me their plate at this conference, or someone exclaimed loudly, oh my God, you're Black, in a job interview, because they thought from my CV that I should look a certain way and from the way I sounded on the phone, right? And so when I get these experiences and I share with them, they're shocked, and they're like, oh my God, how did that keep happening every single stage of your career? But then when I talk with other scientists of color, then they understand it, right? And so I felt that I actually had a responsibility to speak up about DEI-JB issues from an early stage. And so ever since my postdoc, also my grad school, right, I have been in committees, I've been doing the extra seminars, I've been doing the extra mentorship. I was able to switch it around so the service counts at my new role at Cornell, and so I actually have a dual kind of job. And so I'm an assistant professor, but I'm also an inaugural inclusion lead at Cornell for DEI-JB issues. But that's because I feel like because nothing has changed, then my voice has to matter. And if my voice has to matter, then I just have to be louder over the silence. And then in the next question, what can societies do? I think in the last 2 years, if any of you went to my talk this morning, then you'll find out that I end up putting a lot of these sorts of things. What can we do? And highlighting certain issues, right, in DEI-JB. And one of the talks that I did, that I actually, not long ago, answered this question. And I think it's great because what you just kind of put up of what ESA is doing kind of matched with it. And I want to kind of read them out because I think it's important. So what can we do? First, we can have these hard conversations, right? In our society meetings, in our different groups, we need to talk about the issues that are not allowing our ranks, right, our leadership ranks, and also our membership numbers to be more diverse than it should be. We need to engage in DEI-JB programs and initiatives, so we have to make them we have to value them as an important part of our group. We need to fund or expand funding for all of these initiatives and underrepresented scholars to increase their representation. We need to develop codes of conduct for our societies, and all of them pretty much have it now. But then the thing that they don't do is they don't go the next step, which is when somebody breaks part of that code of conduct, what do we do, right? And so what happens is that we have these code of conducts, don't do this, try not to do this, and then someone does something that is harmful to someone else. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we need to have meetings or we need to talk about it because we have not pre-thought what do we do with people that break these codes of conduct. So I think that's really important that we should do. Another thing that we need to do is make sure that we maybe expand geographically where we hold these meetings, right? That's a really big one, that if we go into areas that are more represented by underrepresented minorities, right, then we might enable them to be actually a part, the local voices, diverse perspectives to be part of the conversation. And then we need to acknowledge historical barriers that have allowed our societies to stay the same way. I saw a talk by Maydianne a year ago where you were kind of looking at tracking numbers across a certain society and also institutions, and they stay the same, right? Nothing has changed. And then we have the myth that, oh, there's so many more of different types of scholars out there. You're everywhere. It's so easy to get in these jobs now if you're from these groups, and that's not true. And then we need to reduce bias in society, funding, awards, pubs, etc. And lastly, we need to decolonize our spaces, and that goes a lot into the conversation. And so I have a variety of things, and it's just, part of a talk that I give, so I'm glad you asked that question because it allowed me to kind of bring that in.
How are we doing for time, Chris? We're good?
We've got about 3 minutes left to the.
All right, is there one more question?
There's a couple, yeah.
Maybe we'll throw this one to Cassandra. We'll see how the question is, see how you feel.
I'm ready.
Okay. I just add, there's a bunch of great questions in the app, and I'm sad we can't get to all of them. So this is from Marcel, and do you have any suggestions, sort of concrete ways that we can retain those high-profile folks that you talked about sort of at the start of this conversation? And you've touched on this before, but how we can make our entomological societies and institutions foster belongings amongst those groups?
Cassandra?
Yeah, all right. Well, in terms of retention, right, everyone, in general, everyone wants to feel like they're part of the conversation, like their voices matter, so they want to be heard. They literally want their voices to be heard, for example, in a meeting. Those of you who also identify as women in an audience or underrepresented groups, I'm sure you've all had some version of the experience where you're in a meeting and there's a discussion and people are trying to think of a solution for something, and you say, oh, what about X, Y, and Z? Maybe we should call so-and-so. And either no one picks up on that idea, or somebody says, well, I don't know about that. And then 5 minutes later, your favorite man friend in the meeting says the exact same thing as you did, and all of a sudden this is an amazing idea and that's a great idea. And they don't say, oh, as Cassandra said, I think we should know. They just say it as if it never happened. Our voices literally don't get heard. So one concrete thing we can do is when we're in a meeting with a bunch of people who aren't exactly like us, pay extra attention and make sure that we're actually registering and listening to everything that everyone is saying. What we all have a tendency to do is to take one word out of 10 and then go off on our own mental tangent, and we've literally stopped paying attention to the people who are talking because we're thinking about what we're interested in. And this happens more often to women and to underrepresented people. It's just a fact. And so one concrete thing we can do is to literally become better listeners. And then we can become even better listeners by not only making sure we're paying attention when everyone speaks, but by solidifying whether or not we've really understood what they're saying by doing a classic therapy trick and mirroring it back. I see. So what I think you're telling me is you're recommending that we call so-and-so for insight on this topic, rather than doing what we normally tend to do, which is assuming that we know what they meant, or that we know what they'd like, or that we know what they mean, and going off of that assumption. So paying more attention, listening more closely to everybody, particularly people who are underrepresented, because we are literally not heard as often. This goes a long way towards inclusion. And if there are issues that are arising, particularly brought up by people who are underrepresented in a meeting or in a department or in a society, and these are desires or suggestions that aren't feasible at the moment or aren't practical for whatever reason, we need to still address them directly and explain directly why is it that we can't take action on this. I don't know, one concrete example, there's a seminar room in in one of my departments that's named after a very famous, very important, very racist zoologist. And years ago, I asked the chair of our department why we couldn't change the name of that room, which is where we have faculty meetings. And I was told that it just couldn't be done and it was really difficult. And a few years later, I raised it again with the chief administrator, and they said, they totally agreed with me. It was really embarrassing and really uncomfortable. They also felt really uncomfortable about it. But, they were going to look into it, but they just weren't sure when. And like this, I got gaslit over and over again for years. And then finally, it was some other man's idea that this name be changed. And it didn't take more than a year for the name to be changed. And so when I think things like that, so, that had the result for me, I can just speak for me. I absolutely felt like my voice wasn't heard on that. It wasn't important. It wasn't acknowledged because nothing was done. And so when we need to do more than listen, and we need to take action. And if we can't take action, we need to acknowledge that directly rather than saying, I also feel terrible. I wish something could be done. It's better to just say, I either don't agree with what you're saying, or that's never going to happen, or that's literally out of my hands, but let me help you escalate it to somewhere else where action can be taken if I can't or won't take that action. So I think better active listening all around and more direct addressing of all of our ideas are things that can help all of us feel literally heard and included, and therefore more likely to be willing to stick around.
Thank you. And I think I'll speak on behalf of Chris and myself and the Joint Annual Program Committee in just saying an immense thank you to all three of you for joining us here. I don't think when I was a new member in this society that I ever would have imagined that there would have been an opening plenary with Black women that I admire and respect. Your research careers have been really influential for what many of us do, and certainly in my own work. It has been an honor to share this stage with you. So thanks again to Dr. Extavour, Gordon, and Andrade.